All the Young Dudes, James's Perspective by Staying Dreams. Chapter 11. First Year, Birthdays, Birds, and the Beatles. Fortunately, Madame Pomfrey managed to undo the hair-raising hacks with just a few flicks of her wand, though the restoration of the smooth skin didn't stop her from delivering a proper telling off about the misuse of dangerous magic. James merely sat on the edge of the white hospital cot, swinging his legs with an air of unbothered nonchalance. "As if we wanted to look like Bigfoot," James scoffed, rolling his eyes behind his wire-rimmed spectacles the moment the matron's back was turned. Peter, who was looking chastened and unglued by the authority figure, shifted his weight and mumbled, "Yeah." Remus, meanwhile, stared straight ahead at the opposite wall, his hands flat against his knees. James checked his mate's posture and felt a prick of confusion. Lupin looked more shaken than James had ever seen him over a schoolboy prank. "Blimey, it's just a bit of extra chinwag, mate," James thought. It had to be Severus. He must have coated the sweets in one of his fool potions, Sirius pleaded, his blue eyes flashing with anger as he paced the gap between the beds. Black took his dignity incredibly seriously, and having his flawless facial structure obscured by a wall of fur had clearly struck a nerve. "Yeah, we all know it, mate," James nodded, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. The humiliation of Lily seeing him look like a monster was being replaced by the thrill of an impending tactical campaign. "Don't worry, we'll get him back." Peter, who had been apologizing profusely for what felt like the 100th time since they had left the Great Hall, let out a high-pitched wail. "I'm sorry, I really thought they were from my mom." "It's fine, Peter," James said, adopting a touch more benevolence now as he reached over and clapped a reassuring hand onto Peter's slopped shoulder. "Poor old Pete. Looks like he's about to wet himself," James thought, his leadership instincts kicking in to steady the pack. "Just wish you'd given them to us first thing on a Monday. Then we could have at least bunked off Transfiguration." "I demand retribution," Sirius declared, halting his pacing to raise his wand toward the ceiling like a tragic hero on a West End stage. James burst out into a roar of laughter at his best mate's display. Even Remus managed a quiet chuckle from his cot, though his face remained ghostly, and James could tell the incident had rattled the quiet boy more than he was letting on. Note to self. James logged. Keep an eye on Lupin. The bloke's got the spin of a lion, but the nerves of a fragile owl sometimes. "And you shall have it," James matched Sirius's melodramatic tone, leaping up from his bed and grinning as he struck a sweeping pose. "But patience, my dear Black. Vengeance like this take time. Don't suppose you've got any other brilliant ideas, Remus?" "Sorry," Remus said, shaking his sandy head as he glanced down at his fingers once more, almost as if he were expecting a fresh wave of dark hair to sprout from his cuticles. "I'll help, James," Peter piped up, leaning forward with an expression of desperate eagerness to make amends for his blunder. "I'll do anything. I won't be scared this time, I swear." James offered Peter a validating nod, his mind already spinning a web of counter-strikes involving dung bombs and localized weather charms. They collected their satchels from the matron's office and began their march back up toward the security of Gryffindor Tower. The castle corridors had grown quiet now, the diner rush having dispersed into the various common rooms. James walked at Sirius's shoulder, his trainers clicking against the stone, the warmth of Pomfrey's numbing slave still tingling on his chin. He was just about to pitch a magnificent scheme involving the Slytherin Dungeons plumbing system when they reached the junction of the third-floor corridor. They had just started to round the sharp stone corner towards the moving staircases when a crisp voice cut through the quiet air behind them, calling out a single name. Sirius! All four boys turned around, the leather satchels shifting against their shoulders. The second they spun, Sirius let out a tiny noise of surprise, a sharp intake of breath that put James on a high alert. Standing at the mouth of the corridor, radiating an air of superiority, was Bellatrix Black. James had never liked her, not from the moment he'd spotted her in the Great Hall in September. Some people in the castle might have considered her quite pretty, given her aristocratic features and the cascade of long dark hair. But to James, there was always something off about the elder Black cousin. It was the wild look flickering behind her cold grey eyes, the kind of unstable expression that made your stomach perform an uneasy roll because you could never predict what malicious thing she might execute next. She looked down her long nose at James, Remus, and Peter, as if they were mere specks of dust to be swept off the flagstones. "What do you want?" Sirius asked. James adjusted his spectacles, his heart sinking a bit at the sound of his best mate's voice. It was unusually small, stripped of all its vibrant energy, as Sirius kept his eyes glued to the floor, scuffing his shoes against the stone. James couldn't help but think of how out of character the display was. Black was normally all swagger, bravado, and confidence. Sensing his brother-in-arm's vulnerability, James didn't hesitate. He took a step forward, planting his boots firmly to stand shoulder to shoulder with Sirius, his jaws set in a line. "Come here and address me properly," Bellatrix snapped, her voice as sharp and biting as a January frost. Sirius remained frozen. Seeing his defiance, Bellatrix's pale hand moved with terrifying smoothness toward the pocket of her Slytherin robes, where her wand was kept. James flinched, his fingers hovering over the pocket of his trousers. "Go on then, try it, you loony biddy," James thought, his pride flaring up into defensive anger. If she wanted to act serious, she was going to have to blast through James Potter first. "Come here," her voice dropped, becoming low, quiet and level now. "Or I'll make you, and it won't be a childish little hair-growth charm, I promise." Sirius shot a glance sideways at James, shaking his dark head just a fraction of an inch, a silent signal for James to stay where he was and not provoke her any further. Reluctantly, Sirius took a step forward, separating himself from the pack. James, Remus, and Peter watched in silence as the two cousins spoke in hurried whispers at the dark end of the hallway. Sirius barely lifted his chin from his chest the entire time, his usual loud defiance nowhere to be seen under the weight of his family's shadow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Bellatrix gave Sirius a mocking pat on the head and spun on her heel, her dark robe stalking off down the corridor. The three waiting boys let out an exhale in unison, relieved that the encounter hadn't developed into a full-down duel. Sirius walked slowly back over to them, his posture shaky and his face ghostly shade of white. Not a soul uttered a word as they made their way up the remaining staircases toward the security of the Gryffindor Tower, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a dagger. Once they had finally scrambled through the portrait hole and collapsed onto their usual sofa by the fire, James felt like his chest might actually burst if he didn't break the suffocating silence. "All right, Sirius?" James asked, pitching his voice into what he hoped was a casual register as he tossed his satchel onto the floor. "Yeah," Sirius nodded, though he looked more pale than usual, his fingers twisting the hem of his jumper. She wanted to invite me for tea on my birthday. Reckon my mother put her up to it, probably a family conference about bringing me back into the fold." "Just because you're in a different house?" James asked, his voice rising into a squeak. He found the entire concept of the black family dynamics mental. His parents would have thrown a feast regardless of where the sorting had placed him. Sirius managed a faint smirk, though the amusement didn't come close to reaching his blue eyes. And because of the company I'm keeping? James nodded, a cocky grin returning to his face. He took comfort in the fact that Babulga Black considered an 11-year-old Potter to be a corrupting influence. When's your birthday, then? 2 weeks, the 3rd. I've got to go to the tea, though. Pella wasn't joking about knowing some really vile curses. We'll do something afterwards, then, James said, his eyes sparkling with that brilliant determination as his brain began plotting. If his miserable family is going to ruin his afternoon, James thought, then the Marauders are going to conquer the night. Something good, yeah? Peter and Remus both nodded their heads enthusiastically from the adjacent armchairs, and James felt a surge of leadership fire up in his chest. Sirius might have been born into a house of snakes, but he belonged to the lions now. James was going to ensure that his best mate had the most unforgettable 11th birthday in the history of Hogwarts, no matter what kind of rule-breaking it took to execute it. Happy birthday! James had barely given Sirius enough time to crack his left eyelid open before he was launching himself across the gap between the 4 posters, suckling his best mate into the mattress like a chaser going for a loose quaffle. The 2 boys rolled around in a tangle of woolen blankets and scarlet hangings, wrestling and laughing. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the dormitory, destroying any lingering silence. When Sirius finally managed to gather enough leverage to shove the messy-haired boy off his chest, he clambered out of bed, his handsome features still split by a triumphant grin. Across the room, Peter was standing by the foot of his own bed, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He was holding a small package wrapped in brown paper that looked as though it had been folded, smoothed out, and refolded at least a dozen times since breakfast the previous morning. "Happy birthday, Sirius," Peter said, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "Cheers, Pete," Sirius grinned, running a hand through his dark hair. James scrambled up from the mattress, adjusting his askew spectacles, and glanced over towards the corner of the room where Remus's bed sat. He was expecting to see their quiet mate's sleepy smile peering out from behind the fabric. Instead, James's chest tightened slightly. The velvet curtains were drawn back, the sheets were flat, and the blanket was untouched. He never came back last night, James said, his voice dropping an octave as he noticed the direction of Sirius's gaze. A heavy silence fell over the 3 remaining boys as they all stared at the empty mattress. It wasn't the first time since September that Remus had vanished into thin air like this without a word of warning, but James found that the reputation didn't make the absence any easier to stomach. Where on earth does he keep going? James wondered, a protective concern gnawing at his thoughts. He knew Lupin was a bit fragile, but the disappearing act was becoming a proper mystery, one that James was becoming determined to solve. Sirius shrugged his shoulders with theatrical nonchalance, forcing an unbothered tone into his voice as he broke the spell. "Probably off plotting the downfall of the Slytherins. Evil genius, that one." James and Peter let out a synchronized chuckle, though the sound felt a bit hollow in the morning air, and they all agreed not to dwell on the shadow hanging over the morning. Determined to make the occasion as special as possible, to combat whatever misery Bellatrix was going to dish out later, James had arranged a flying session for the 3 of them. He had spent 20 minutes the previous afternoon burbling Madame Hooch, utilizing his most charming smile and a string of solemn promises regarding exemplary behavior, which he intended to keep. Well, probably. The afternoon in the pitch had been a triumph, but the real masterpiece occurred during dinner, just before Sirius had to slip away to change into his formal robes for the dreaded family tea with his cousins, James caught Peter's eye and gave the signal. Leaping onto the wooden bench, James led the entire Gryffindor table in a round of deafening Happy Birthday, followed by an off-key rendition of For He's a Jolly Good Fellow. James conducted the chaos with a stray drumstick, ensuring they sang, "And so say all of us," over and over again, each time making it louder, faster, and more obnoxious than the last. The display continued until Professor McGonagall marched down the aisle, her severe features set in a terrifying scowl as she threatened the entire first-year section with a week's worth of detention if they didn't shut their traps immediately. James merely winked at Sirius as they finally sat down, thoroughly pleased with the spectacle. Later that evening, long after Sirius had marched off to his execution and the fire in the common room had burned down to embers, Remus finally reappeared through the portrait hole. He claimed in an apologetic whisper that he'd suddenly been taken ill, and Madame Pomfrey had forced him to stay locked in the hospital wing all day. James adjusted his glasses, looking at his friend skeptically. He didn't buy the cover story for a second. Remus looked exhausted, sure, his pale skin bearing 3 fresh scratches, but he didn't look any more ill than he usually did after one of his mid-month disappearances. Through James's mind, the behavior was baffling. It's mental, James thought, a twinge of hurt crossing his mind on Sirius's behalf. If it were me, I'd crawl out of my own deathbed and fight past a 3-headed dog just to make sure I wished my best mate a happy birthday. He couldn't comprehend prioritizing a bit of a lie-in or a mole sniffle over a broader milestone. But seeing the defensive look in Remus's amber eyes, none of the boys pushed the issue or questioned the alibi. By the time the next morning came around, the riddle was pushed to the back of James's mind, caught up in a whirlwind of herbology essays, transfiguration theory, and prank planning. There was too much fun to be had in the present to spend the day worrying about where the shadows went at night. As November trudged onwards, the dreary Scottish days grew shorter and the castle grew darker, forcing the first years to spend the majority of their free time cooped up inside the stone walls. Huddled by the hearth in the Gryffindor common room, the boys passed their long evenings playing rounds of exploding snap and plotting their next counter-strike against Severus Snape. The first term was drawing to a close, and the Hogwarts staff, who James was convinced were a bunch of sadists, seemed to take a twisted delight in piling on more essay work than they had all autumn. To combat the academic deluge, Sirius had taken up a new habit of reading his textbook passages aloud whenever they sat down to conquer their assignments together. James found the display equal parts annoying and amusing. It was distracting when he was trying to calculate the properties of a switching spell, but whenever he shot his mate a pointed scroll across the parchment, Sirius would simply pout. "It helps me think, Potter," Sirius would protest. "I've got to catch up to you somehow." James decided to let the irritation slide, adjusting his glasses with a nod. In truth, his radar had picked up on the fact that Sirius had been falling behind in several of his classes lately, and James's loyal streak meant he wanted to give his brother-in-arms the best chance to catch up to the rest of the pack. Still, as he watched Sirius flip through a herbology guide, James couldn't help but ponder what had caused such a drastic change in the boys' routine. Whenever the two of them weren't attached at the hip, Sirius would vanish into the depths of the library, either trailing behind Remus or slipping off on his own. James couldn't fathom the logic behind it. It was a total mystery why a bloke would spend hours lurking the dust-covered bookshelves if he wasn't studying. A few nights later, after wrapping up a particularly brain-numbing study session in the library, James was making his way back up toward the security of the tower when a commotion echoed from the intersecting corridor. His curiosity piked. James turned the stone corner at a fast stride, his trainers clicking against the flagstones. He ground to a halt as he found a cluster of upper-year Slytherin students surrounding a smaller figure. As he closed the distance, a jolt of adrenaline struck James's chest. It was Lily Evans, trapped at the center of the ring. Her pale face was flushed a brilliant red with a mixture of embarrassment and fury as the older snakes hurled a barrage of insults at her. Then the word mudblood rang out, sharp and ugly, against the high stone ceiling. The sight of Lily, her knuckles white as she gripped her school bag, her emerald eyes bright with a sheen of unshed tears, felt like a punch to James' gut. He didn't know much about the pure-blood politics his parents avoided, but he knew cruelty, and he knew he loathed seeing this girl concerned. Without an ounce of hesitation, James stepped into the torchlight, his hand dropping to his wand as his voice rang out. "That's enough. Leave her alone." The Slytherins, startled by the appearance of the Potter boy, backed off. They sneered, casting a few nasty glances at Lily, but retreated down the staircase rather than risk a public brawl with a first year whose family held half the gold in the ministry's sites. James turned to her. His carefree swagger completely vanished, replaced by an intense concern etched across his features. "Evans, are you okay?" Instead of the grateful sigh or the classic storybook thank you he had expected to receive, Lily's scowl only deepened. Her green eyes blazed with a violent fire that caught him off guard. "Why did you have to interfere, Potter?" Lily demanded, her voice shaking with an angry tremor. "I could have handled it." James blinked behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, taken aback and bewildered by her hospitality. Flipping heck, he thought, his chest expanding with a mixture of confusion and defensive pride. "I've just chased off a pack of rabid snakes for her." "I couldn't just stand by and let them treat you like that," James argued back, his voice rising a fraction as he crossed his arms. "It's not right." Lily crossed her arms in a mirror image of his posture, her frustration filling the narrow corridor. "You don't get it, do you? They were mocking me for being a Muggle-born, for not belonging here." The weight of her words hit him with the force of a bludgeon, knocking the wind out of his heroic assumptions. James stood frozen, his mind performing a painful role. He realized with a wave of discomfort that he'd been so focused on playing the hero, he hadn't stopped to consider how deeply the malice of the insult wounded her independence. He had treated it like a schoolyard scrap, but to Lily it was a question of her right to exist in the castle. A protective earnestness washed over his initial confusion. He stepped closer, his brown eyes locking onto hers with unyielding certainty. "But that's not fair, Evans," James burst out, the bluntness of his voice echoing off the masonry. "You belong here as much as anyone else. You're one of the brightest witches at Hogwarts. Just ignore them. They're not worth it." Lily's temper flared, and she lashed out with a defensive venom that caught him off guard. "It matters, Potter. Some people can't see past it. You don't understand because you've never had to deal with it." James's stomach twisted. Not in that gravity-defying way it usually did whenever Lily Evans was standing within his direct radius, but in a much worse manner. He lowered his brown gaze to his trainers. The wind knocked out of his sails as a wave of helplessness washed over him. Flipping heck, he thought, his throat tightening as his certainty crumbled. "I only wanted to protect her from those pureblood kids." "I just wanted to help, Evans," James muttered, his voice dropping into a defeated space between them. "I didn't mean to make things worse." Lily's green eyes shimmered with a fresh sheen of tears, her voice thick with frustration as she adjusted the strap of her school bag. "You don't get it, Potter. You just don't get it at all." Before he could even attempt to find the right vocabulary to salvage the wreckage, She stormed off down the corridor. Her leather boots clattered against the flagstones, the click echoing her fury. James was left standing alone in the drafty hallway, feeling like an idiot. He tried his best to be the hero, but according to her, his intuition had only exacerbated the nightmare. He trudged back up toward the moving staircases, his hands shoved deep into his uniform pockets, as that hollow sensation refused to leave his gut. What on earth did I do wrong? James wondered, his mind performing a frustrated role. Wasn't this how the universe was supposed to operate? A bloke was meant to stand up for the girl, shield her from the dark things, and play the perfect knight in shining armor. What was the bloody point of running into the fray if all it earned him was a harsh scolding and a face full of tears? Lily's furious face flashed behind his eyelids, and James wiped at his own eyes with the sleeve of his scarlet jumper, annoyed with himself. Why did he always have to care so deeply about what she thought? It never seemed to get him anywhere but the target of her temper. When he finally pushed through the portrait hole, the familiar chatter of the other marauders hit him like a physical comfort. They were huddled together in their usual spot in front of the hearth. A circular gobstone sport spread between them. They were continuing a multi-day tournament they'd started earlier in the week, mostly utilizing the match as a way to teach Remus the rules. James ground to a halt, leaning his shoulder against the stone wall to track the layout. He didn't want to bring his dark cloud into the circle just yet. "You've seen them, though," Sirius was saying, his blue eyes wide with a weird intensity. "You've seen them performing." "Not in real life," Remus replied smoothly, though he shifted a touch against the cushions of his armchair. "No, I know on the telephone," Sirius nodded sagely, crossing his arms with the misplaced confidence on a pureblood who thought he'd mastered Muggle terminology. Remus stifled a laugh, a rare spark of amusement lighting up his pale features. "On the television, mate. It's more like those moving paintings you lot have. Only black and white, and only the Beatles. The Stones came on once, but Matron made us turn it off because of their hair." "What about their hair?" Sirius asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Too long," Remus shrugged, leaning forward to inspect the board. "She said they looked dirty." "My hair is much longer," Sirius countered, his handsome features twisting into an offended pout as he ran a hand through his dark locks. "Yeah, it is," Remus conceded with a small grin, "but Muggle boys don't have long hair. Not normally." "Don't tell him that," Peter teased, letting out a high-pitched chuckle from his spot on the rug. "He'll shave his head." With a flourish, Peter tossed a stone across the carved board, knocking one of Sirius's pieces straight out of the playing ring. The disrupted stone squirted a dense jet of portrait liquid into the air. Sirius narrowly avoided the blast by throwing his torso backward with spectacular reflexes. Peter grinned from ear to ear, pumping his fist in victory. "Ha! Take that, Muggle lover!" Watching the chaos unfold by the fire, a fond smile spread across James's face, erasing the lingering sting of his encounter in the corridor. He adjusted his glasses, his chest expanding with a wave of clarity. "Flipping heck, why am I losing my marbles over Evans?" James thought, his resilience returning full force. What did it honestly matter if he didn't possess the perfect blueprint for navigating girls? What did it matter if Lily Bloody Evans was annoyed with him? He didn't need her approval to have a perfect existence. He had everything he would ever require right here in front of him. His boys, his pack, his family. Sirius let out a loud swear word, scrambling up from the floorboards as he prepared to storm off toward the dormitory, serious to change out of his compromised uniform. He ground to halt. However, the second his blue eyes locked onto James, leaning against the masonry, Sirius's face lit up with excitement. "Oi, mate! Didn't see you there. When did you get back?" James laughed, the final remnants of the hollow feeling in his stomach evaporating. He stepped forward into the warmth of the hearth, slinging an arm around Sirius's shoulders. He glanced down at the liquid stain spreading across the sleeve of Sirius's school robes, grinning. "Let's go get you cleaned up," James said, gesturing toward the spiral staircase. Sirius raised an eyebrow at the affectionate behavior, but allowed James to lead him toward the safety of the first-year dormitory. As they began to navigate the stone steps away from the noise of the common room, James reached up with his free hand, ruffling the other boy's long black hair until it stood up in a chaotic nest that mirrored his own. "By the way," James added, his voice filled with a protective loyalty, "I like your hair long."